Islamic, Zoroastrian, and Manichaean traditions in Sasanian and early Islamic Near East, to a PhD degree in rabbinics and Iranian studies from the University in Jerusalem. He also was a postdoctoral associate at the Kiel program in Judaic Studies, Harry Starr, postdoctoral fellow at Harvard Center for Jewish Studies, and he is the author of Sexuality in the Babylonian Talmud, Christian and Sasanian Context in Late Antiquity. Please. Thank you.
She wants to sit there.
Thank you.
The early Islamic Near East can arguably be seen as the cradle of rabbinic, Islamic, and Zoroastrian jurisprudence. While the rabbinic and Zoroastrian legal traditions are firmly rooted in earlier centuries, in Talmudic literature and the Sasanian and Zan, respectively, and while the antecedents of Islamic law can likewise be traced back to earlier centuries via Roman, Sasanian, Arabian, and rabbinic materials, the legal culture that developed between the 7th and the 10th century in the Near East is emphatically marked by growing legal abstraction, theorization, codification, and systematization. The contribution of various jurists and legal traditions to these broader processes amounts to what I would term the jurisprudential turn in the legal culture of the early Islamic Near East. An important element standing at the heart of this jurisprudential turn is the legal canonization of central religious works, namely the Mishnah and Babylonian Talmud, the Quran and Hadith, and the Avesta and Zan, which came to be regarded by rabbinic, Islamic, and Zoroastrian jurists as the authoritative and normative sources of revealed law. Legal canonization, in this sense, must be distinguished from notions of textual canonization. That is, the establishment of textually fixed versions of the religious works. Legal canonization, for the present purposes, transcends the mere crystallization of the sacred text in fixed textual form and focuses instead on the relationship of the community to these texts as sources of religious normativity. As such, a process of legal canonization can occur before or after the textual canonization of a given text in either oral or written form. The jurisprudential term was, of course, anything but monolithic, as the processes associated with the theorization and systematization of the law and the various legal traditions were dynamic, complex, and multifaceted. Indeed, the jurisprudential shifts took distinctive shapes and forms in the various legal traditions, and no less importantly, in the thought of different jurists belonging to the very same religious tradition. The present lecture will focus on the intersection of legal and theological processes of canonization, which took place in the Gaonic Islamic and Zoroastrian traditions in the 9th and 10th centuries. I will center on the contribution of Rav Shrira Gaon, the head of the Academy of Pumbedita, Al-Shafi, the so-called architect of Islamic jurisprudence, and Adul Fanbai and Manus Chir, both 9th century Zoroastrian jurists and high priests to these developments. I will argue, within the limits of the allotted time, that these more or less contemporaneous and adjacent authors contributed in a rather similar manner to the legal and theological canonization of their respective religious works. The Quran and Hadith, the Mishnah and Babylonian Talmud, and the Avesta and Zan. A process by which these corpora came to be regarded as the authoritative and binding sources of the law by virtue of divine revelation, and as legal codes embodying the divine word and combining God's logos and nomos. To be sure, even prior to the contribution of Shrira, Shafi, Adufarbai, and Manas Shir, all three religious traditions assumed, in one way or another, that the works under discussion reflect and partake in a broader notion of revealed law. This assumption, however, as we shall see, is a far cry from the assertion that the Quran and Hadith, Mishnah and Babylonian Talmud, and Avesta and Zan are the only authoritative and binding sources of the law, embodying the totality of God's revelation, the production of which was guided and orchestrated by God Himself. Let me begin with Shafi'i's theory of Islamic jurisprudence. Shafi'i developed the unprecedented idea that the Quran and Hadith are the sole and ultimate sources of God's revealed law, against the backdrop of competing theories which placed emphasis on other sources of the law, such as the Hanafi doctrine of Rai, legal reasoning, or Ibn Ulaya's theory of ijma, consensus. Shafi'i's jurisprudence was formulated first and foremost in contradistinction to that of his former teacher, Malik ibn Anas, according to whom the communal practice, amal, an ongoing collective tradition of Medina, the city of the Prophet, vouchsafed and preserved by the scholars of the city, and those who received from them, ought to be regarded as an independent carrier of revelation alongside the Quran and Hadith. The authority vested in the Medinan tradition was personal and mimetic, rather than textual and hermeneutic. The blind following of an amorphous tradition associated with Medina was viewed by Shafi'i as a negative form of taqlid, imitation, which he understood as the acceptance of a position without textual hermeneutic evidence. The problem with this kind of taqlid was mainly the absence of a transparent connection between a legal ruling and the normative textual evidence on which it should be based. In opposition to the non-textual legal sources of custom, practice, amal, legal reasoning, rai, and consensus, ijma, Shafi'i sought to ground the entirety of Islamic law in the textual authority vested in the Quran and Hadith. Joseph Larry has convincingly demonstrated in this regard that Shafi'i's concept of the bayan, that is, the several combinations of Quran and Hadith through which God had revealed His law to humankind, lies at the heart of the jurisprudential theory presented in his Risala. And excuse the, I see the long vowel was misplaced here in your handouts. His well-known epistle on legal theory, Kitab al-Risala fi Usul al-Fiqh. The entirety of the law resides, therefore, in the complementarity of Quran and Hadith, while all legal rules are necessarily and by definition manifested through one of the five possible combinations of these sources. The Quran alone, Quran and Hadith together, each expressing the same rule, Quran and Hadith together, whereby the Hadith explains what is briefly in the Quran, Hadith alone, and finally, in case God's law is not apparent in the Quran or the Hadith, one ought to engage in ijtihad, legal interpretation, which is based, at least in theory, on inferences from the Quran and Hadith. The idea that the Quran and Hadith are the only binding and authoritative legal sources articulating the totality of God's revelation can also be seen as an extended argument for the binding authority of legal Hadith alongside the Quran. To quote Larry again, it also seems clear from the structure of the law as portrayed in the Risala and from some of Shafi'i's remarks therein that Shafi'i considered the prophetic Hadith to be revelation, on a par in that respect with the Quran. And take a look at sources 1 to 3 in your handouts, which exemplify the legal and theological equivalence of the Quran and Hadith in Shafi'i's thought, and their exclusive status as binding sources of the law, embodying the totality of God's revelation. In his discussion of the canonization of Islamic law, Ahmed al-Shamsi has argued that Shafi'i's work represents a watershed in Islamic jurisprudence, in the sense that the locus of legal authority was transferred from the living practice of the Muslim community to a written and increasingly demarcated canon of authoritative textual sources. Prior to Shafi'i, and Shamsi argues, the Quran and Hadith represented the raw material of religious law, vouchsafed perhaps in a vague notion of divine revelation, but in no way regarded as the canonical manifestation of God's revealed law. These works were continually being sifted through the filters of communal experience, custom, personal legal reasoning, and consensus. The process of legal canonization validated the legal and theological status of the Quran and Hadith as the very fount of Islamic normativity, an embodiment of God's revelation. What changed was not the work itself, but the way it was perceived. It was Shafi'i who forcefully advocated the exclusivity of the Quran and Hadith as the only authoritative medium of God's revealed law. A similar theoretical model, I submit, governs the legal and theological canonization of the Mishnah and Babylonian Talmud, according to the epistle of Shri Gaon. Whatever the author of the Mishnah, the authors of the Mishnah intended for it, it was likely not perceived in the centuries following its compilation as the sole and complete articulation of God's revealed oral law, Torah Sheba'al Peh. Although both Talmuds situate the Mishnah at the center of their hermeneutical endeavor, thus reflecting a certain sense of canonicity, they consciously deviate from its rulings on the basis of either both textual and non-textual sources of the law. It is only in the Gaonic period that we first find the idea that the Mishnah, now alongside the Babylonian Talmud, is the exclusive and complete embodiment of legal revelation. Talia Fishman has convincingly demonstrated that Shrier's epistle makes unprecedented claims about the composition of the Mishnah and its legal and theological status. Portraying Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the compiler of the Mishnah, as a human agent in a divinely guided project aimed at a comprehensive textual, yet not written, articulation of the oral Torah. It is God who revealed the oral Torah to Moses, and it is He who, after many generations, guided Rebbe's compilation project, reflecting its accurate and systematic textual embodiment. The divine characteristics of the Mishnah are manifest both in its textual and stylistic perfection, as well as the providential assistance manifest in the fact that Rebbe encountered no objection or difficulty whatsoever from within or without the rabbinic community to hinder his ambitious compilation project. Sources 4 and 5 in your handouts contain some of Shrier's assertions to that effect. Fishman further argues that the repeated allusions in the epistle to divine guidance and the perfect qualities of the Mishnah bring to mind contemporaneous Islamic discussions, Navijaz al-Quran, a theological and literary concept describing the matchless nature of the Quranic discourse, although the term itself, of course, does not appear in the Quran. Not unlike Shrier's portrayal of the Mishnah, the Quran's inimitable and miraculous nature was seen in its perfect style, the uniqueness of the Arabic language, and we discussed this issue earlier, and the Quran's brevity and conciseness, facets which are emphatically stressed throughout Shafi'i's epistle. While several Jewish authors participated in this discourse by arguing for the perfection, brevity, and conciseness of Scripture and biblical Hebrew, and that's a well-known phenomenon, Rav Shrier significantly extends this discourse by making similar claims about the Mishnah. This is not to suggest that the Mishnah wasn't viewed as one of several manifestations of Torah Sheba'al Peh, partaking in a broader notion of revealed law prior to the 10th century. It does suggest, however, that Shrier's epistle is the first systematic articulation of the idea that the Mishnah is the only normative source of the law, alongside its binding interpretation and elaboration reflected in the Babylonian Talmud, and that it represents the exclusive and complete articulation of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the compilation of which was guided by God Himself so as to vouchsafe divine revelation in a perfect textual form. While Fishman's interpretation of Shrier's account of the Mishnah's compilation is compelling, she stops short of extending her argument to Shrier's description of the redaction of the Babylonian Talmud. But such an extension seems very likely, since the epistle maintains a clear structural and thematic equivalence between the process that led to the compilation of the Mishnah by Rebbe and that which led to the redaction of the Babylonian Talmud, supposedly by Rav Ashi and Ravina. In this context, Shrier emphasizes that just like Rebbe, Rav Ashi enjoyed the unanimous and undivided support and submissiveness of his contemporaries, while using the very same phraseology to describe the two monumental projects. Thus, for example, Shrier asserts, from the time of Moshe until the time of Rebbe, we did not find Torah and greatness in one and the same place, And later on he says, from the time of Rebbe to the time of Rav Ashi, we did not find Torah and greatness in one and the same place. Sources 6 and 7 in your handouts contain other indications of the divine guidance and inspiration that accompanied the redaction of the Babylonian Talmud by Rav Ashi. Indeed, this is how Rav Shira's epistle was understood by some of its recipients and readers. Consider, for example, the assertion of Rav Nisim of Kairwan in source 8, which is undoubtedly based on some version of Rav Shira's epistle. Shira's epistle manifests, therefore, the unique legal and theological status of the Babylonian Talmud as the complete binding and canonical textual embodiment of God's oral Torah, alongside the Mishnah. This perception of the Babylonian Talmud was a Geonic innovation. To quote Robert Brody, the greatest contribution of the Geonim to the course of Jewish history was the elevation of the Babylonian Talmud to canonical status. The Talmud is an extremely complex literary work, comprising legal and other materials which evolved over several centuries. Even in its legal portions, many discussions are wholly or partly of an academic nature, and many disputes on practical issues remain unresolved. Furthermore, the material is not organized systematically in the style of a legal code. A single issue may figure in a variety of contexts, and the relationship, if any, between the various discussions, as well as the weight to be assigned to them in deriving legal conclusions, is rarely self-evident. We have no way of knowing to what extent, if at all, the editors of the Talmud intended to create a normative legal work rather than an academic or literary corpus. The situation in the Geonic period, Brody says, was fundamentally different. The Talmud was now perceived as a closed corpus, not textually, legally. I would only add to these astute observations that according to Shira, the Talmud was now perceived as a closed canon not only in terms of its binding normative capacity, but also, and no less importantly, in terms of its theological characteristics as a complete and exclusive embodiment of God's revealed law, of Torah Sheba'al Peh. It is in this capacity that Shira stresses that the redaction of the Babylonian Talmud by Rav Ashi, just like the compilation of the Mishnah by Rebbe, was guided and inspired by God. All in all, Shira presents a fascinating jurisprudential theory based on an innovative assumption of the unique legal and theological status jointly accorded to the Mishnah and Babylonian Talmud as an exclusive and complete textual articulation of God's revealed law, while emphasizing that the historical processes, supposedly historical, that led to the compilation of these works were guided by God himself in an attempt to vouchsafe Torah Sheba'al Peh in a perfect textual form. The distinctive jurisprudential theory reflected in Shira's epistle is in many ways similar to Shafi's construction of the legal and theological elevated status of the Quran and Hadith. While scholars have previously noted the interesting fact that Shira's epistle engages in a broader Islamic discourse concerning authority and tradition, responding to both Islamic debates concerning Hadith as well as Karaite challenges to rabbinic authority, the particular and detailed connection between Shira's epistle and Shafi's Risala went by and large unnoticed in scholarship. For both authors, it is not the religious work itself that changed. The Mishnah and the Quran were textually fixed by the 9th century, while the Babylonian Talmud and Hadith were well on their way of becoming textually fixed. But rather, the normative and theological status of the work vis-a-vis the community. Works that were previously seen as a partial and incomplete manifestation of God's law, partaking in a much broader and vague notion of revelation, were legally and theologically transformed by Shafi and Shira into exclusive and complete articulations of God's revealed law. A similar jurisprudential theory is articulated by contemporaneous Zoroastrian authors, who sought to ground the canonical status of the Avesta and Zan as the exclusive and complete articulation of Ahura Mazda's revelation of his law to Zarathustra. While the Zand itself goes back to the Sasanian period and probably even earlier, the 9th century Zoroastrian authors transformed and transcended its legal and theological status alongside the Avesta. According to the Denkard, the compilation of which began by Adul Farnbai, son of Farokhzad, high priest of the Zoroastrian community in Iran, during the first half of the 9th century, and completed by Adur Bad, son of Ahmed, in the 10th century, the Zan was revealed to Zarathustra in its entirety together with the Avesta. Not unlike Rebbe's attempts to recover the contents of the oral Torah revealed to Moses at Sinai, and Rav Ashi's attempts to recover the meaning and logic of the Mishnah's rulings, according to Shrira, the Denkad, in source 9, portrays a multi-generational project of recovering the lost contents of the Avesta and Zan, undertaken by a set of Iranian kings and sages, highlighting, as it were, the constitutional moments of this process. Shlomo Pinus has pointed out the striking similarity between the Zoroastrian myth of recovering the lost Avesta and Zan and Jewish medieval traditions concerning the recovery of the lost wisdom of the Hebrews. In the present context, I would like to point out that beyond the recovery and collection of lost wisdom, the attempt to recover the content of the Avesta and Zan revealed to Zarathustra and handed down from generation to generation is astonishingly similar to Shrira's account of Rebbe's attempt to recover the content of Torah Sheba'al Peh, revealed to Moses at Sinai, and Rav Ashi's attempts to recover the meaning of the Mishnah's rulings. The notion of fighting off heresy, which you can see in source 9, and particularly disbelief in the authoritativeness of the Zoroastrian Zan, coupled with a project of recovering the contents of the Avesta and Zan, is likewise reminiscent of the Karaite challenge to rabbinic tradition and Torah Sheba'al Peh, which underlies Shrira's account. The Pahlavi Zandi Wa'aman in source 10 describes a council headed by the Sasanian king Khusro that purportedly took place in the 6th century. While this passage attributes to Khusro's convention the fighting off of heresy and attempts to deal with disbelief in the authoritativeness of the Zan, another reconstruction of this very same 6th century council, found in the epistles of Manuschir, a 9th century jurist and high priest, maintains that Khusro and his council were responsible for the canonization of the Avesta and Zan, and the setting of its boundaries and legal contents. Manuschir account appears in source 11. I'm going to read this in full. It was like when Wei Shapur showed in the assembly of Khusro, the mortal soul, king of kings, son of Kawad, the 21 divisions of the Avesta and Zan, so that the sages abided by it. And they sealed the document, so that it was the way the sages agreed with it, and as it had been decided. And afterwards the sages agreed with all the decisions he showed them in that manner, to keep them as something special, as being on the level of certainty and in firm usage. Excuse the very literal translation. Very much in line with Shrira's historical account of the processes leading to the compilation of the Mishnah and Babylonian Talmud, Manuschir imagines the compilation of the Zan by the Sasanian king Khusro by projecting a council that allegedly took place in the 6th century, pretty much the time of the redaction of the Talmud. Both Shrira and Manuschir emphasize the unique legal and theological status of these works, which contain the complete, binding, and exclusive articulation of God's revelation. Both mention the undivided support and submissiveness of contemporaneous sages to the compilation project, and both stress the finality of the work. They seal the document, in the words of Manuschir, and its elevated legal and theological status, to keep as something special, as being on the level of certainty. And this is not to say, of course, that the historical evidence is such, but this is a rhetoric, a portrayal of history, of course, by Manuschir. Actually, Manuschir himself had severe disagreements with his brother, another priest named Zadspram, regarding these very same issues. While the legal and theological status accorded by Manuschir and Adufan by to the Avesta and Zan, and that accorded by Rav Shrira to the Mishnah and Babylonian Talmud, are similar in many ways to Shafi'i's claim about the Quran and Hadith. And while all the authors considered addressed similar concerns pertaining to authority, tradition, and revelation, it is noteworthy that only the Geonic and Zoroastrian accounts we have examined provide a reconstructed historical narrative, as it were, of the compilation process. Shrira, Manuschir, and Adol Fanbai appear to have grappled with a problem that wasn't of much concern to Shafi'i, namely the gap between the purported time of revelation of Torah Sheba'al Peh to Moses, or that of the Zan to Zarathustra, and its textual embodiment centuries later, millennium later, or more. This problem required a compelling response to the question of how the Torah Sheba'al Peh and the Zan were transmitted from the time of Moses and Zarathustra until their final textual manifestations, albeit in oral form, and why their textual embodiment took place only at a much later historical moment. As far as Shafi was concerned, however, there was no real need to reconstruct the narrative, such as the one provided by his rabbinic and Zoroastrian contemporaries, since God's revelation to Muhammad and its textual embodiment in the Quran and reports of prophetic practice are said to have occurred at more or less the same time. Nevertheless, it remains quite tempting to view Shira's assertion, quoted from the Talmud of course, that Rav Ashi and Ravina are the end of instruction, Sof Hora'ah, in the light of the Islamic notion of Muhammad as seal of the prophets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our first respondent is Dr. Dennis Alfred. He was specialist